diversion services as a consultant. So Ellen Copeland and I share a lot of mutual patients. Same thing with Dr. Gonzalez. Next slide. And so what I'm going to do is take us through a background of the forensic population, as well as several intervention points that we may or may not be aware of. And then we'll conclude it by going over treatment options. Next slide. And so by the end of this objective, I'm hoping that you'll be able to identify the importance of MOUD before, during, and after forensic involvement. Also be able to recognize limitations to MAT access in the forensic population, as well as understand how we can assist our clients with access to care for opiate use disorder. And built into that naturally is addressing the stigma that comes with opiate use disorder, as well as having the issues that stem from being involved in the correctional system. Next slide. And so a lot of us may or may not know somebody that's been arrested in one time in their life or another. But what you may find is that it's becoming more common, just like opiate use disorder is. And so in June of this year, believe it or not, but we surpassed China in terms of the number of people that we have in our penal system. And so we're now number one in the world for incarcerating our citizens. Next slide. And so not only does this affect the patients and clients themselves directly, but it also affects people in their community. Economically, they estimated costs $1.5 to $2 trillion. And it's estimated that just average Joes, folks like you and I, they have a 1 in 100 chance of being arrested or incarcerated at some time in their life. In the minority population, sometimes it's 1 in 17, 1 in 15. So it gets more concentrated in terms of which clients we're working with. And so it's important to be conscientious of that. Next slide, please. Now, if we're looking at the people that we work with that are struggling with substance use disorder, there's not a linkage, but there's a really high correlation that a lot of them may also have interface with the forensic system and vice versa. And so this is up to 50% according to some studies. Now, that's just including the jails and jails. But if you broaden it out to include prisons, in terms of opiate use disorder, almost a quarter of the inmates in the Department of Corrections have reported using heroin at one point in their life. And that's quite a large number. If you can imagine, for those that are addicted to opiates, that's a huge black market economy that the Department of Corrections is also involved in indirectly. And because of that, it's just something that we have to address. Now, how it affects patients themselves is that if somebody has opiate use disorder and they're all multiple medical comorbidities, psychiatric comorbidities, as well as psychosocial suffering is a lot higher. And this could be in terms of HIV and hepatitis C infections. It could be poorer mental health, more overdoses. In fact, if we take a look at the overdoses themselves, you may be surprised that they have a 13 times greater chance of overdose from opiates. And this isn't just limited to the United States. If we go overseas and we look at our siblings in England, one of the studies showed that they had a 29 times higher risk of overdose compared to those that without opiate use disorder. And so if you can flip the slide for me, go to the next slide. I want you to take a look at this darker graph, this darker bar that's kind of a teal color. That's the opiate overdose rates for people that got out of being incarcerated on week 1. And so week 1, usually what happens is somebody did not get adequate treatment, no treatment at all sometimes. They still have urges, they still have cravings, even though they're not going through withdrawal anymore. And so what they sometimes do is they use the same amount of opiates that they were using before they were arrested and incarcerated. And a lot of times what will happen is their tolerance will evaporate. They'll lose their tolerance, use that same amount, and end up accidentally overdosing. All right, so this takes us to intervention points. And you may think, well, I don't know what to do. It's too vast and chaotic. But there's a couple things that we could do. The first contact point in terms of the systems is addressing that if there's any interface. And so a lot of times we have access to. Sorry, I'm driving. I'm going through Louisiana, and there's all these swamps and shit, and all these bridges, and so there's no way for me to pull over. But it's all right. I'm a multitasker. I used to be able to read the Sunday paper while I'm driving around Albuquerque, so it's all good. I'm a professional. Anyway, EMS is usually the first contact or interface that the forensic patients may ever get in touch with. And even if they have bad friends that just drop them off at the ED or they call 911 and then they take off, the EMS or the police as first line responders will usually introduce them to Narcan. And Narcan is an antidote that we can use to reverse an opiate overdose. It's something that's widely available. Any of us can go get it from a Walgreens. Any of us can go get it from a Walgreens, no problem. You can get it without a prescription. And if you'd like, come by ASAP, and we'd love to give you a free Narcan rescue kit. But a lot of times, the police are our allies as well. We've had APD programs and collaborations where we were trying to see if we could get APD to administer the Narcan rescue kits as well as use them. And so that's one of the intervention points. Oftentimes, another intervention point is instead of taking them to jail, sometimes they'll reroute them to an emergency department where they can start the process for getting treatment. An example of that is you may have worked in the PES, Psychiatric Emergency Services at UNM, and they may bring a patient who is breaking multiple laws. However, the police identified that they would be better served getting substance treatment and psychiatric treatment. So that's another intervention point. Another one is sometimes people will interface with police and they won't be arrested. Maybe they'll be summoned to report.
You got muted for a second, Dr. Romo.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. What I was saying is another route is sometimes they'll interface with the police, and instead of being arrested, they'll be summoned and have a hearing. And at that time, the DA, the attorney, and the client may decide that they're a candidate for pretrial services or drug court. Now, drug court first emanated as a way to help reduce repeat offenders with things like DWIs, but it's expanded to include other substances. And so this is another route where people may be given an alternative where if they agree to urine toxicology surveillance, meeting with counseling, going to AA, things like that, and NA, that they may be able to avoid jail time. And so pretrial services, drug court, and the forensic jail diversion services will sometimes work together in synchrony to get the patient treatment. Now, other access points and intervention points are when they're actually inside a facility. I'll use Metropolitan Detention Center as our example, but they have a couple of treatment programs within the jail. One of them for people with opiate use disorder is our methadone maintenance program. And if a patient has opiate use disorder, they're able to access methadone. We don't yet have the ability to give them the other two FDA-approved medicines, which are naltrexone and what's the other one? Suboxone, which is also buprenorphine. But they're working on expanding those resources as well. Inside there, they also have things such as a program called Albuquerque Treatment Services, or ATS. And what that is it kind of mimics components of IOP so that they can learn how to navigate some of those triggers, cues, learn behavioral interventions. That way, when they're released back into the community, they don't get tangled up with the exact same things that may have led them to the incarceration. Now, within UNM, for those of you that network with us, UNM has something called jail diversion services, where if somebody's incarcerated, upon their release, they'll be paired with a case manager and sometimes a therapist who can help them navigate the system, make appointments, things like that. And that seems to help with reduce recidivism, so that a person that's struggling with opiate use disorder doesn't get caught in the revolving door. And this is especially true if they have a co-occurring disorder. We can go to the next slide. So like I said, there are programs in the country that provide substance treatment. For the most part, it's methadone. Reason that it's methadone is very cheap. It's about $60 for 10,000 milligrams. Suboxone is much more expensive. But for those rare facilities that do offer methadone, when they study them, they notice that there's reduced drug use as well as reduced criminality in the patients that participate in those programs. And that's the same for after they're released too. When they do the follow-up studies, they're seeing that the post-release substance use and relapse is a lot less. Same thing with criminality. The recidivism rates start to change and improve. And these benefits seem to extend out a year from when they were released following incarceration. And that's according to random controlled trials when they take a look at it. Now, despite this positive data and these studies that repeatedly demonstrate that there's positive benefits for patients that participate in these programs, it may come as a shock to know that the Department of Corrections doesn't really support this. There's some jails that are scattered throughout the country that do have methadone programs, but for the majority of the time, they're not embracing this. They've done studies that looked at naltrexone and Vivitrol, but those haven't seemed to pick up a lot of steam either. And there's a lot of reasons and ways we could speculate, but it shouldn't be too much of a reach to say to yourself, especially if you've worked closely with patients that opiate use disorders, that they face a really powerful stigma. And so a lot of times when they start to meet criteria for opiate use disorder, they start to alienate themselves from their own community as well as their family. And that can happen from repeatedly causing trauma to their family, stealing money, the lies, and all the other kind of things that go along with somebody meeting more and more criteria for opiate use disorder and not being able to control it. And it can be very heartbreaking and heavy on a family member for a son to or a daughter to say to their mom, I promise I'm never going to use again. I got it behind me. And then later that afternoon, they're in their mom's purse stealing their money. And these kind of repeated injuries affect the whole family. But that in itself is a tremendous stigma that we as a medical community need to overcome, and we as a society need to overcome. But it becomes that much more amplified when somebody becomes arrested. When somebody's arrested and they go into jail, they put on usually some kind of overalls. If they're not high violence or high risk, they'll put on orange overalls at MDC. If they're real violent, they'll put on the burgundy ones. But even just that very action of putting on an orange suit is extremely stigmatizing and has a really profound psychological impact. For example, if any of us on the network right now had some parking ticket or speeding ticket uh, that we never paid, we just, I'll use myself as an example. Here you got this guy doing echoes, you know what I mean? Getting pulled over using his phone. He got like stacks of notes. And I'm always getting pulled over for doing like presentations while I'm driving in different states, but they can never catch me because I'm always going state to state. I'm like a presenting outlaw, you know what I mean? I'm renowned, they know me, but they can't catch me, but they finally do. So when I'm going to be treated completely differently, once I get naked, once I I have to put on those overalls. So just from that one moment to moment, putting on those overalls is symbolic that, you know what, even though we're supposed to be guilty, or I'm sorry, we're supposed to be innocent before found guilty, just the mere fact that I had to put on that suit, in a way may make me subhuman, may make me seem that I'm guilty. And people that do have to put on the overalls when they're arrested feel it completely, especially when they have to walk into the courtroom wearing those. They don't feel like they're innocent before they're guilty. And it creates a very powerful differential. For example, if I'm treating some of the patients that I'm talking about, there's an immediate power differential there because I can exit at any time and they can't. They're stuck in there. And so the stigma, when you put those two factors together, is very powerful. So it's important to be conscientious of that. And just to add to that, if any of you on the network have ever worked with a patient that has a felony, uh, do you think it's easy for them to get a job or to qualify for housing when when the housing landlord does a background check? Exactly. And so they have a lot of stigma mounting against them that we have to help counteract. Go ahead and take us to the next slide though. But I want to show you some data from MDC in terms of uh, of the impact that opiate use disorder and methadone treatment has. And so if you look at both of these graphs, the solid lines are people that got methadone. The dashed lines are ones that did not get methadone. And so that point right in the middle is where they were arrested. So if they look going 3 years back, it looks like they follow almost the exact same pattern in terms of their probability of being arrested. The ones that get methadone maintenance treatment, they do a lot better. The chance and likelihood and percent that they'll get rearrested and reoffend is a lot less compared to an escalating pattern where the percent and the percent of times that they get rearrested is a lot higher. And that's evidenced by that dashed line going up and extending out after 1 year, 2 year, 3 year. And that's that revolving door that I was talking about where somebody gets addicted, they get in the system, they never get treatment. And because the cravings are uncontrolled and they're still meeting criteria for opiate use disorder, they reoffend and they get incarcerated again. And that just continues on and on until something happens that breaks that cycle. Let me have the next slide, please. So basically, we have multiple benefits if we look at not just Albuquerque and Bernalillo County, and not just in terms of a patient's health and changing their recidivism rate, but also economic costs. And they've repeated this in other places such as Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, here in New Mexico, and other countries as well, such as Australia. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And when I say it improves the cost, this is what I mean. So see that dotted line? What that means is that's about how much money it costs to incarcerate somebody for 1 day. And on the bottom line, WTP basically means like a worth to pay. So if we invested, say, $45 in somebody and it costs $116 to incarcerate them, $45 into a program would mean that maybe 80% of those people would not be repeat offenders. We wouldn't see them reincarcerated. And if we invested $60 or $75 in a program, it goes almost up to 90% of them won't be repeat offenders or end up reincarcerated within 1 year. And so even from a cost perspective, it seems to benefit our overall society. For example, did you know that 40 to 60% of Bernalillo County funds goes to fund MDC and the things connected to the correctional system? So they do take a big chunk out of where our money's going. And so when we have programs in place that show that we can make a difference for our forensic population, we need to all advocate for and lobby for these kind of changes. Next slide, please. Now, I alluded to this earlier, But the naloxone rescue kits are not just limited to being passed out from EMS and being carried by providers like us. The jail has also piloted programs where they distribute naloxone rescue kits to patients upon discharge. We've also done studies looking at naltrexone and Vivitrol, which are opiate blockers that they can give people before they're released from prison and jails, especially to get them coverage, because that first week, according to that UK study, shows that that's where a lot of them are at risk for accidental overdose and death. We never want to underestimate the power of 12-step. Narcotics Anonymous is a great referral source for people. And it's not a provider that takes them through it. It's a patient that actually recovered and did that inner work that the steps force people to go through and face that shadow side of themselves in order to recover. If you refer somebody to NA, make sure that you also have them seek out sponsorship. That's basically like an extension of what you do at all times, because the sponsor agrees that that patient can pick up the phone, call them, and they can give them a lifeline if they feel like they're about to relapse or they need to get to a meeting fast to get more stabilization. Keep doing the things that you're doing in terms of individual and group counseling. And these are happening at a certain scale within the correctional system, but nowhere near what the forensic population needs. And so when they get out and they interface with you, make sure to be conscientious that they may have been needing these services, but that they've been neglected to the point where they get to the first appointment with you, with what your clinic has to offer. Also remember that they're coming directly from an environment where if you show emotion, it could be dangerous. An example of that is, say I'm working with a patient that has PTSD, and I know from your previous didactics that you've been taught that PTSD and opiate use disorder are highly correlated. And so if I'm doing a screening on somebody and I'm starting to detect PTSD, I'm not gonna elicit the details of that trauma. I don't want to risk that they're going to have breakdown and cry, because I can leave the pod, but then they're going to be stuck in there with everybody that witnessed them cry, and maybe think that they're weak and maybe even attack them. And so you got to realize that this is the mentality that they may be coming at you with. So they may have their guard really up, but I guarantee that if you form and keep that therapeutic alliance going that you're so good at creating, you're going to be able to gain that trust, touch that wound. And that's where the true healing begins, because it's not all about getting rid of craving and withdraw for an opiate. A lot of times that's what was underlying it that made them want to numb up, made them want to forget about it and get temporary relief, because that diagnosis, the very first criteria of it is that they're re-experiencing the intrusive trauma of what happened to them. And if we think about some of the horrendous things that people do to each other, I'm sure it doesn't take you much to imagine what that person may have gone through. I'd like to open it up real quick for questions. And I know this was a quick overview, but I hope that you were able to walk away with the importance of identifying the resources that we do have out there when it comes to the forensic people, where we can interface, and how we have to address stigma along those lines in order to get them the best care and access to treatment possible.